first presidential elections in the United States were held in the year 1789. If the original framework, intent, and regulations around US presidential elections were still intact, then in 2016, Hillary Clinton would have been Donald Trump's vice president. And in 2020, Donald Trump would have been Joe Biden's vice president. Yes, up to the election of 1804, the candidate getting the second highest electoral votes automatically became the vice president. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we go back in time to look at all the US presidential elections in history and analyze the patterns to assess the impact to the country as a whole. Now, when the US Constitution was drafted, it was the late 18th century. Not even the 19th century. We were still in the late 18th century. And since there wasn't any mode of mass communication, the framers of the Constitution felt that it was not possible to adequately inform the average citizen so they could make the right decision towards choosing the President of the United States. Their solution? Have the citizens elect electors from each state and then have these electors vote for the President of the United States. And each state would be allocated a number of electors equal to the sum of its senators and members of the House of Representatives. The electors were supposed to cast 2 votes on one ballot, each vote for a different candidate for president. And the President of the Senate then opened and counted the electoral votes before a joint session of Congress. The candidate winning the largest number of electoral votes became president, and the one receiving the second largest number of votes became the vice president. Now, around this time, there were no formal political parties. So in 1789, George Washington won the presidency by a margin of 69 to 34, beating John Adams, who became his vice president. In the next election in 1792, the same story was repeated, and once again, George Washington and John Adams were returned to power. The one thing to remember here is that George Washington was really reluctant towards continuing as president because of his age, but he was influenced by those around him to continue to ensure the young nation stayed stable and united. And this framework failed its first test in 1796 with the emergence of political parties, when candidates from 2 opposing parties became the president and the vice president. John Adams, a Federalist, narrowly won the presidency by a 71 to 68 margin over a Democratic Republican, Thomas Jefferson, who became the vice president. But the peak drama happened in the election of 1800, when 2 Democratic Republican candidates, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, tied for the top spot with 73 electoral votes each. Technically, Aaron Burr was Thomas Jefferson's running mate. But because the voting did not differentiate between the president and the vice president, since the top 2 candidates were tied, either of them could be the president of the United States. And the tie, per the Constitution, could be broken by the House of Representatives. The House met in February of 1801 and ultimately handed the presidency to Thomas Jefferson by a majority of 10 states to 4. The chaos surrounding the presidential election of 1800 led to the 12th Amendment of the Constitution, which mandated separate votes be cast for president and vice president in forthcoming elections. And subsequently, in 1804, Thomas Jefferson returned to power, beating the Federalist Charles Pinckney. Thomas Jefferson's political party, the Democratic Republicans, continued to hold sway over the seat of the president for the next 4 terms till 1824. And all in all, being out of power for 6 consecutive presidential terms was enough to move the Federalist Party into oblivion. The election of 1824 saw the drama go to a whole new level. The 1824 election was the first time in which a large majority of electors were chosen by voters rather than by state legislatures. And as a result, there was active campaigning on behalf of the candidates to spread the word and turn out their base of supporters. Some of the ex-Federalists had joined hands with others and started calling themselves National Republicans, while the Democratic Republicans had renamed themselves to just Democrats. There were 4 candidates in the fray, and Democrat Andrew Jackson received 99 electoral votes, whereas John Quincy Adams, a National Republican, received 84 electoral votes. Since no candidate had received an absolute majority, the election once again went to the House of Representatives for the final votes. And after a lot of backroom deals, some of which were clear cases of quid pro quo, John Quincy Adams was declared president, even though he had received fewer electoral votes than Andrew Jackson. Starting 1828, a majority of the states started holding conventions to endorse candidates. Since the selection of presidential electors was being decided by the voters in most of the states, public opinion was becoming more and more important. Rallies, parades, and other public events were held, and the supporters of candidate Andrew Jackson even established a pro-Jackson newspaper. Active campaigning also meant that slander and mudslinging was introduced into the campaigns. Andrew Jackson was accused of being an adulterer, whereas John Quincy Adams was accused of being a corrupt bargainer. In the end, the Democrat Andrew Jackson emerged victorious with 178 electoral votes to John Quincy Adams's 83. Andrew Jackson returned to power in 1832 with 219 electoral votes, beating the National Republican Henry Clay, who received 49. The election of 1832 also saw a third political party, the Anti-Masonic Party, who fielded a candidate, William Wirt, who received just 7 electoral votes. Now, a quick word about this third political party. Basically, it arose out of a movement that was ignited in 1826 by the mysterious disappearance of William Morgan, a bricklayer in Western New York. Rumors floated that he had been murdered at the hands of the Masons because he was about to reveal some secrets about the organization. Mason meaning the bricklayers. Surprisingly, this issue became strong enough that a lot of candidates from this movement were successful in state and local elections, so the politicians saw this as a vote-catching possibility and created this third political party. By the middle of 1834, though, a lot of the opposition parties, like the National Republican Party and the Anti-Masonic Party, had coalesced into a new party, the Whig Party. But since the Whigs did not have any unifying platform, nor a national convention, several state legislatures fielded their own candidates for the presidential election of 1836. So in the fray were 5 candidates: Martin Van Buren, the Democrat, 3 candidates from the Whigs, and 1 anti-Jackson. In the end, Martin Van Buren romped home with 170 electoral votes, beating his closest Whig rival, William Henry Harrison, who polled only 73. By the election of 1840, the two-party system had become firmly entrenched in the United States politics. The Whigs were now trying hard to unseat the Democrats, who had been in power since the election of 1828. This time, the Whigs held a national convention in December of 1839 and nominated William Henry Harrison for the presidency. This election also saw the highest voter turnout to date, and William Henry Harrison won with 234 electoral votes to Van Buren's 60. At 67, William Henry Harrison was the oldest to be elected president up to that time, and he delivered his inaugural address for 2 hours in a cold drizzle, wearing no gloves or overcoat. He contracted a cold that later developed into pneumonia, and after 1 month's service, he became the first president to die in office. John Tyler, his vice president, subsequently became president. And John Tyler wanted to be the presidential candidate for the Whigs in 1844, but he had made too many decisions that ran contrary to the stand of the Whig Party itself. And these included stacking his cabinet with Democrats. So the Whigs rallied behind Henry Clay as their presidential candidate. The Democrats, too, had a tough time narrowing down on a candidate, but finally garnered support behind James Polk, who seemed more adept at reconciling fundamentally opposite positions. Since he was not that well known, the Whigs coined a slogan, "Who is James Polk?" And the Democrats countered that with assaults on Clay's moral character. Around this time, the issue of slavery was becoming more center stage, and the ideological divide between the northern and the southern states on this issue was becoming more and more prominent. The Democrat James Polk won the presidency by a margin of 170 to 105 over Henry Clay. At the outset, Polk had indicated that he would not be seeking re-election. So in 1848, the Democrats once again had to find a new candidate. They rallied behind Michigan Senator Lewis Cass, whereas the Whigs, realizing that their only presidential victory had been secured by a military hero, gave the nomination to Zachary Taylor. The issue of slavery continued to occupy center stage, and as a result, an alliance of disaffected Democrats, anti-slavery Whigs, and a splintered faction of the Liberty Party formed the Free Soil Party, which very clearly stated its opposition to the extension of slavery. The 1848 election was also the first time in which all states voted on the same day, owing to a federal legislation that had been passed 3 years earlier that fixed the date of presidential elections to prevent any voter fraud. The Whig candidate Zachary Taylor won the presidency by a margin of 163 to 127 electoral votes over Lewis Cass. The Free Soil Party failed to collect any electoral votes. And almost like a repeat of 1840, Zachary Taylor suddenly died of an attack of cholera 16 months after taking office. The presidency somehow seemed to be jinxed for the Whigs, and Taylor was succeeded by his VP, Millard Fillmore. The election of 1852 was contested in the aftermath of the Compromise of 1850, which was a series of measures passed by the US Congress to kind of address the slavery issue. But what they ended up doing was a compromise, trying to appease both sides. And the net result was the postponement of the Civil War by a decade. Both parties promised adherence to the Compromise of 1850. It was the Democrat Franklin Pierce who won the presidency by a margin of 254 to 42. Only 47 years of age at the time of his election, Pierce became the youngest man to be elected US president at that time. His vice president, William King, took the oath of office in Cuba, where he had gone in search of a cure for tuberculosis. And by doing so, he became the only American vice president to be sworn in on foreign soil. But he died from tuberculosis soon after returning to the United States. The election of 1852 was marked by a very low voter turnout, mainly because of the widening gulf between the northern and the southern states. Now, one thing to note is that up to the election of 1852, the United States comprised only 31 states, and most of these states were within eastern United States of today. There were only two exceptions, California, which was extreme west, and Texas, which was sort of in the middle. But the key difference was that California joined the Union as a free state. That is, it had no slaves. Whereas Texas joined about 5 years before California as a slave state. And this is an important piece of information because in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, which left it to the states to decide via popular vote whether they would join the Union as slave or free. This nullified the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had established the northern boundary beyond which slavery was not permitted. So Northerners were outraged, and the midterm election of 1854 saw the ouster of many Democrats from Congress. And following this massive shakeup, many Democrats and Whigs left their parties to join one of the two new parties, the Know Nothings, which was essentially an anti-immigration party, and a newly established Republican Party, which opposed slavery. Surprisingly, it was the Democrat James Buchanan who won the presidency by a margin of 174 to 114, trouncing his Republican rival John C. Fremont. The Whigs were essentially wiped out, and the Know Nothing Party gained 8 electoral votes. John Buchanan essentially came to power, winning several key northern states, citing the possible dissolution of the Union should anti-slavery sentiments prevail. So by the time of the election of 1860, the divide between the northern and the southern states was complete. The Democrats had to host 2 conventions to narrow down on a candidate for presidency. And even then, the Southern Democrats nominated their own candidate, John C. Breckinridge, who ultimately lost to the Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln by a margin of 72 to Abraham Lincoln's 180. Not surprisingly, before Lincoln's inauguration itself, 7 southern states, led by South Carolina, seceded from the Union, setting the stage for the American Civil War, which would last from 1861 to 65. Going into the election of 1864, the candidacy of Abraham Lincoln was in serious doubt since the Civil War was still continuing and there seemed to be no end in sight. But Lincoln was able to win over the nomination by maintaining a more non-partisan stance, and the Republicans on their own tried the same by replacing Vice President Hannibal Hamlin on the ticket with Andrew Johnson, a former Democrat senator from Tennessee. Though the Democrats were against the proclamation of the Emancipation, there was a divide with respect to how the Civil War should end. There was a faction that wanted peace and a negotiated settlement with the South, whereas there was another which wanted the war to continue. The Democrats were ultimately able to strike a compromise and rally behind George McClellan for the presidency. But the interesting piece in this election was that since the southern states had seceded from the Union, only the northern states were participating in this election. Very close to the election, in early September, Union General William Sherman captured Atlanta, and this significantly boosted the northern morale and the voter turnout, sending Abraham Lincoln back to the White House with a massive majority of 212 to 21. But just 2 months into his second term, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, making Andrew Johnson the new president of the United States. The election of 1868 was the first to be held after the Civil War, and the primary issues in this election were the reconstruction of the South and suffrage for the newly freed slaves. And the Republicans selected an immensely popular general during the Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant, as their presidential candidate. There was still a lot of conflict between the Democrats and the Republicans around the implementation plan for the reconstruction of the southern states. However, Ulysses S. Grant's last line in his letter of acceptance of the Republican nomination, "Let us have peace," became the campaign slogan for the Republicans. Ulysses S. Grant captured the presidency with a margin of 214 to 80, beating his Democrat rival, Horatio Seymour. And as a result of Ulysses S. Grant's election, the Republican Reconstruction Plan was allowed to continue, and Congress soon ratified the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote could not be denied on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Please note that the right to vote was still denied on the basis of gender. However, a key event that happened during the election of 1868 was the first ever presidential impeachment in the history of the United States. The then sitting president, Andrew Johnson, was impeached in the confusion and aftermath of the American Civil War. Before he was assassinated in 1865, President Abraham Lincoln had formulated a plan of reconstruction of the defeated South as it rejoined the Union. He planned to grant a general amnesty to anybody who pledged an oath of allegiance to the United States and agreed to obey all federal laws pertaining to slavery, with the exception of high-ranking Confederate officials and military leaders. And Abraham Lincoln also had a plan around these states, forming governments and starting to send representatives to Congress. Andrew Johnson was intent on carrying out this plan when he assumed the presidency. But this did not sit well with some radical Republicans in Congress. They wanted to set up military governments and implement more stringent terms for readmission for these states which had seceded from the Union. And this tension between the president and the radical Republicans reached a head when Johnson breached the Tenure of Office Act by removing Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, from his cabinet. The Tenure of Office Act had passed over Johnson's veto in 1867, and it stated that a president could not dismiss appointed officials without the consent of Congress. Abraham Lincoln, too, had issues with Stanton because he seemed to be part of the radical wing of the Republicans. Andrew Johnson considered the Tenure of Office Act unconstitutional and wanted it to be tried in courts, but before he could do so, he was himself subject to the impeachment trial. The House of Representatives impeached him on February 24, 1868, but the Senate failed to convict him by just one vote. A two-thirds majority is needed to convict, and it fell one vote short. Incidentally, in 1926, about 60 years after it was enacted, the Supreme Court declared the Tenure of Office Act invalid. But a big question remains. If Abraham Lincoln had still been around, would he too have been subject to the impeachment? Your guess is as good as mine. And it is on that note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Which official in the Lyndon B. Johnson administration made the following statement in reference to the Vietnam conflict? Quote, "Look, if you think any American official is going to tell you the truth, then you are stupid. Did you hear that? Stupid." End quote. During a press briefing with Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs, Arthur Sylvester, he's supposed to have asked the assembled members of the press to report more positively on Vietnam. And when he got confronted by the press that they could not be reporting incorrectly, he made this statement. So the answer is C, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs, Arthur Sylvester. Question for the current episode. At the end of World War II, the United States comprised 48 states. Which two states joined the Union after World War II? Were these A, Arizona and Alaska, B, Arizona and Hawaii, C, Alaska and Hawaii, or D. New Mexico and Alaska? Once again, which two states joined the Union after World War II? A. Arizona and Alaska, B. Arizona and Hawaii, C. Alaska and Hawaii, or D. New Mexico and Alaska? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. In the next episode, we continue our coverage of the US presidential elections from history, starting with 1872 and taking it all the way to the present day. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.